what is Sufism in your eyes? And do you see it as a movement, as a methodology, or some sort of orientation within Islam? How would you define it?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, first, thanks for having me over, and nice to have you on this side of the ocean, or the pond, as they say. Yes. But right on its off the bat, we have to separate between what they call a had and a rasm. A had, that is the essential common thread that defines something.
Right.
And then a rasm could be a common theme, but is not essential. To give an example, if we were to say a Muslim in London, the rasm, the common conception, would be probably an ethnic background person, right? Most likely, but that's not necessarily the case. There's plenty of white Muslims, yes. British Muslims. So there's only one common thread that goes across the concept of Sufism and Tasawwuf, which is that it is the pursuit of divine love through dhikr and zuhud. Dhikr being remembrance of Allah, very broadly termed. It doesn't have to be the dhikr of a bead, of use of beads. And the zuhud is disentanglement from distractions in your heart. So again, that's very broad, because it may not necessarily be the zuhud of the hands. It may not necessarily be zuhud physically. Uthman ibn Affan, is he not a zahid? But he physically had so much wealth and power around him. Yeah. He couldn't avoid it his whole life. That's the common thread. There is no aqidah common thread across Sufis. Right. Nor fiqh, nor political stance, nor personal temperament. Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, he goes over 200 ways to look at this in definitions, and he said it's sidq at-tawajjuh ilallah, the sincere directedness towards God. That it is a very individual subject. Right. And I think most importantly, I don't have an interest in defending a term or a group, because also terms, words shift and they migrate, and they may be good in one era and they may symbolize something bad in another era. What we care about is the madmoon, or the content. And tasawwuf, at its best, it symbolizes the greatest personal goal that a person can have, which is the pursuit of love of Allah. And Allah speaks about love in the Quran between Him and His ibad and His creation, the human being specifically, in many places. We can't even have to go into it here. But also the Hadith Qudsi speaks about the highest position an individual can have with Allah, in the famous hadith called the Hadith al-Tawadu', and can be also called Hadith al-Wilaya, about worshiping Allah privately, personally, individually, until you reach a level that Allah says He loves you. Before that, He loves the obligatory act. The obligatory act is the focus of Allah's love. After doing many supererogatory acts, then the person becomes the recipient of divine love. Before that, he's just the recipient of divine mercy and guidance, but not love. So to attain that is the highest goal of every individual Muslim. And this is something no two Muslims would ever disagree on. And the terms and words are just indicators to that. If we don't like a word, we can all swap it. As they say famously, La mushahata fil istilah. If a word bothers you because of a certain connotation, then we're not here to defend a word that is not directly from the Quran. Humans made up this word, right? The early Muslims made up this word to symbolize these people.
Would you say that someone could achieve those ends, be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, have a love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for Allah to love him, without necessarily that person subscribing to the modern methodologies of Sufism, for example?
There are two ways we could go about the methodologies. One way is that which is clearly mashru'a, or clearly dictated in the sharia and the sunnah, as the nafila. Forget the obligations, we're already past that. That's a given. Obligations and prohibitions in that famous hadith of wilaya is a given. But he continues, وَلَا يَزَالُ يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ. He continues to draw near to me with extra good deeds.
Yeah.
And the nafila has room. There are, nafila can be, come in different forms, right? So it could come in the form of prayer. Night prayer could come in the form of fasting. It could come in the form of recitation of Quran. If you open up the door of recitation, well, how do you recite it? Right? There's even discussion about this between the scholars on that. So there's so much room for some judgment calls, matters of nafila that have a judgment call in it that people can differ on. And then there are things that there's no difference upon.
Today I want to talk about Sufism and how potentially it's been politically co-opted. But I'm fascinated in just this base conversation about what Sufism is and what it isn't. Often, especially amongst non-Muslims who develop this sort of trend to become closer to the spirit or spirituality, they would often sort of hold on to Sufism as a means by which they can become closer to the spiritual, to the divine. The conversation we just had implies that there is a deep interconnection between loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for Allah to love you, and the pursuit of following the sharia by the obligations and the nawafil actions. How important is the sharia to this sort of scheme of gaining closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Well, the Sufism became popular in the West in the 60s and 70s through Americans and British people who had been pre-influenced by Christianity and its monasticism, by their delving into Buddhism and Hinduism. So when they came upon that strand in Islam, I think they superimposed that on top of it.
Okay.
And that's why the initial introduction of Sufism into the West, it was a Hindu, Buddhist, Christian slanted spirituality that you actually don't necessarily find in Islam. Historically, you don't find it.